Reading that, I feel like a grumpy old parent haranguing his disobedient children. It's hard stuff. Reading the Bible sometimes is like being invited to consider, to contemplate a strange new world. It is a world that is both like and unlike our present world. I believe the Sermon on the Mount, what did I say? The might? I don't know what I said. Doesn't matter. The Sermon on the Mount, I can't say, I'm just going to keep plowing through that error. The Sermon on the Mount invites us to imagine things as they should be. However, and this is the dark side, if you will, of the Sermon on the Mount, in helping us imagine how things should be, sometimes it doesn't help us deal very constructively with how things actually are. Let's look at this. So Jesus says that if we are angry with a brother or sister, we will be liable to judgment. Anger is an involuntary reaction to something usually perceived as injustice of some sort, whether it's actual or perceived, it doesn't matter. And I would ask, isn't it good to be a little angry or perhaps a lot angry at injustice? Now, in the perfect world, we would have no need of anger because being perfect, there would be no injustice. The perfect and ideal way to live then would be without anger. But as we all know, this world is far from that world. It's far from perfect. And getting angry sometimes is not only unavoidable, sometimes it's appropriate. Now, of course, we all know that unchecked, uncontrolled anger can be a problem, but is it realistic to say that all anger is wrong? Sometimes, again, we should be angry. If we hear, for example, of the Holocaust, we hear about residential school children being abused and murdered and buried in secrecy, and we don't get a little angry or a lot angry, I'd suggest something's perhaps wrong with us. Our moral compass needs tweaking. So Freud saw three aspects, and forgive me, I'm not a psychologist, so I might be butchering this a little bit. Talk to Diane afterwards, who can clarify any errors, but Freud saw three basic aspects of the human personality: the id, the superego, and the ego. The id is the instinctual desires, the just wanting this and wanting that. The superego is the rigid and somewhat moralizing voice telling us what we should and shouldn't do. And the superego is more or less fixed and doesn't move, doesn't change dramatically after you're about 5 years old. And the ego, for Freud, is that part that sort of mediates between the desires of the id and the moralizing of the superego, kind of finds a happy medium, if you will, tries to navigate those two rival desires or compulsions. Now, Lutz, a really great biblical scholar in my mind, I bring this all up just to introduce Lutz's citation. He says, his argument is one of the problems with Jesus' teaching on anger is that, and I'm quoting Lutz here, is that one's superego needs to exert absolute control, even to those areas of our private feelings. In other words, in order to keep this teaching that Jesus is giving, it would be necessary for our superego, the moralizing, rigid sort of finger wagger in our heads, in our minds, it would be necessary for that part of us to be able to exercise complete and total control of ourselves. But of course, the superego does not have that kind of control. So what all this means is that what Jesus is asking is basically something that we can't do even if we wanted to do. It's literally impossible. So again, my contention is that this verse is more about drawing our attention to a world that does not yet exist than it is interested in providing detailed instructions on how to navigate our present world. Anger has no place in the perfect world, but I believe it does. It's unavoidable, and the best way we can navigate anger is to navigate it and to accept it, not to just reject it as something other. Otherwise, that's where uncontrolled anger happens, is where people haven't integrated it, haven't owned it. But Matthew's Jesus continues. He says, everyone that looks at a woman with lust has committed adultery with her in his heart. Now, when you look at the history of interpretation of this passage, the history of how the church has understood this passage, it has been often taken to call healthy and consensual sex into question. Adopting a male perspective, which is problematic too, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time there. Jesus tells us not to gaze lustfully at a woman. Now, the Greek word is gune, gynecologist. I'm not saying that exactly right, but you know what I'm saying, being interfered by the actual Greek word. But the word can be translated as woman or even as wife. And so this has led some in the history of the church to say that men should not even look upon their own wives with desire. And then from this, it's been argued that basically we should reject sex altogether. Sex is problematic in any form, and perhaps we should throw marriage out with it. Now, those are pretty extreme views, but they've cropped up every now and then in the history of the church. Even if it's not quite that extreme, the church has a pretty good track record at being uncomfortable with the whole idea of sexuality. It's not something that the church has often really had a really great relationship with. And it's often historically been seen as either something to overcome or something to reject. And the beauty of a committed sexual attraction as a powerful means of human connection has been rejected or just missed. So while Jesus is teaching, again, I think is in the perfect world and in this world, nobody would objectify anybody else, right? So on one level, there's something really good and decent about this teaching. If we're just being led by our desire to take a body of somebody else's and use it for our own gratification, that's not the way to build human community and human relationships. But there's much about integrating sexuality and spirituality in this world that this text is not going to help us with. The next section denounces divorce. Now, Jesus talks regularly about this. Whether divorce is something that somebody can move past or be forgiven of is not even considered in this text. Marriage is, of course, anyone who's married for anything more than 3 months, and perhaps even that's drawing the thing a little bit too low, has come to realize that marriage is hard work. It's not easy, and it can be tempting to throw in the towel just because things get difficult. But that being said, sometimes relationships can get abusive, and in such situations, it's good to throw in the towel. Fact is, it's probably the best thing you can do. And I can imagine other reasons why you might want to legitimately throw in the towel. But again, in the perfect world, which again is what I'm arguing, this is the whole teaching is try to bring our minds and our contemplations to, relationships would never fall apart. No relationship would fall apart. And of course, we know that this is not that world because relationships do fall apart, unfortunately, in this world. Life is complicated, and divorce is probably never the best thing that can be imagined, although sometimes in this world it might be the best choice. Jesus goes on to make things very complicated for people by forbidding oaths. Now, if you look into the history of the church, this has had huge impact in certain sects of Christianity, which their whole self-identity was determined around forbidding oaths. And it's more insidious than you realize. So much of participation in the society on so many different levels is determined by our ability to take oaths, legal procedures, getting married, many other civic procedures, all sorts of things that we just background noise that we don't even think about that require taking an oath. And Jesus is saying it's difficult to imagine a society, in fact, where there are no oaths. It's hard to know exactly what that would look like. And while it might be difficult to imagine, there's something lovely about this teaching. Nevertheless, William Penn, a Quaker, argued Swearing is forbidden by Christ, he says, because it is damaging to human nature, because it creates two types of truth, and it's unnecessary. So ultimately, what Jesus, I believe, is saying here is that everything we say should be truthful. And if everything we say is truthful, then you don't need oaths. Oaths are like, it's like saying everything else I just said is, suspect, whatever. You take it with a grain of salt, but this is truth, right? So it's like creating two levels of truth, and everything we say should have integrity. And of course, in the perfect world, oaths would be completely unnecessary because truth and beauty would be the only things that are ever spoken. So again, my conviction is that this sermon is calling us to consider, to create a place in our minds for a moment to imagine a world that does not yet exist. To imagine for a moment, now realizing it's just your imagination, so don't get too caught up, but don't get too old so that we can't learn to imagine. We can imagine things. It's good to imagine. Imagination is not just for the young. Imagine a world for a moment with me where there is no anger, because peace and love run through everything like the healing rivers of God. Where everybody is profoundly objectified and nobody is objectified. Everybody is profoundly valued and no one is objectified. I think I butchered that sentence. Hopefully you're following me. Where no one ever breaks faith and no relationships ever break apart. This is the world that exists in God's imagination, a world hiding, if you will, in the future of God. And this is what the Sermon on the Mount is inviting us to imagine. And it's so easy to read the Sermon on the Mount and just feel guilty and beaten up. And that's not helpful. That's not going to get you anywhere, at least not my assessment. I don't think that we like to beat ourselves up. That's something we feel good about, but really it doesn't get us anywhere. Sometimes, though, we can get so used to this present world, to the way things are, that we forget about this wonderful, strange world existing in the imagination of God. And we start thinking that this is the only way things can ever be. And then we get trapped. So it's good to take up this vision of a world ruled and infused by love, peace, faithfulness, and truth. This is a necessary vision, but we also need to inhabit this world. We need to be able to live in the real world too. And I'm personally not sure the Sermon on the Mount has a great deal to offer us in navigating this world. Sometimes in the present world, the best we can hope for is a wisely mediated compromise. We need adult egos to take the hand of the moralizing parents within us and the fun-loving children in us and try to make room for both good and fun in a wholesome and healthy way. And that's not easy to do. But in doing this, again, it's like we need to have one foot firmly planted in the world of God's imagination and the other foot firmly planted in this world. And we need to be able to live in that dichotomy, in that tension. Some of the good things in the world of God's wild and strange imagination, the kingdom of God, we like to call it. Some of those things will have to wait for a time because I don't think we're quite ready for them yet. Evolutionarily or biologically or whatever, we're just not there yet. But we might still, in this time and place, hear the voice of God, and we might hear, again, the Spirit whispering, lifting our hearts beyond this world to imagine another realm where the impossible is possible. May it be. Amen.